Welcome back. So I had anticipated that I would cover Amamutsan tribal bands history, right, in my previous lesson plan, but it was getting too long. The lecture was getting too long. So I just moved that into its own separate unit. And so I'm going to do that here. And the idea here is that you have read a couple things, right? You've read the Amamutsan tribal band's website, how they articulate their history. I think this is cool because we get to hear their perspective from their official words, right? Of course, it's not a scholarly article. It's written for a general audience, and you might want to think about that. How does this differ from the writing of, for example, Lisa Brooks? And what does that have to do with the audience that the people who wrote that history might have? And then you read a little bit about living Amamutsan perspectives. Again, this is so essential in Indigenous studies because not only do we learn the history, but we also insist Native American peoples are still here. Amamutsan people are still here in spite of the centuries of genocide, forced assimilation, etc. And as we do that, my question for y'all is going to be, how do we apply the lessons from Lisa Brooks to this place right here? How do we think about where we are right now, or at least where Cabrillo is, and maybe both if you're doing this from somewhere else, far away, another state, for example, or another country? How do you apply this idea of native space, of trying to see the land differently, to where you are, to where Cabrillo is? And that's going to be what we're doing today. And I'm just going to give a brief overview. So Amamutsan tribal band, they are what they describe as a previously recognized tribal group, which means that they have that history of nation-to-nation negotiations and engagements with European powers and the United States. They were previously called the San Juan Band. They were never terminated. That is a reference to a set of federal policies that were shaped U.S. It was a piece of U.S. policy in the 1950s, and to some extent, 1940s and 50s. And basically what happened in that period was the United States it officially recognizes Native American nations, many Native American nations, right? When it recognizes, hey, we have a nation-to-nation relationship with you. That comes with certain obligations in terms of treaties. It comes with certain obligations in terms of reservations and trusts, as well as access to certain federal programs such as health care and other things that indigenous diplomats have negotiated for. All kinds of things. And so in the 1940s and 50s, in this era of what was called termination, the idea was that the United States federal government terminated its nation-to-nation relationship with many different Native American peoples. Essentially, the United States just didn't want to deal with it anymore. It tried to forcibly assimilate indigenous peoples, and at that point it just gave up. And it just wanted to be like, look, whatever, you're just another citizen just like anyone else. We just want to stop our obligations to you as a sovereign nation. And so tribes that are terminated in this period mean that they are no longer legally acknowledged, legally represented as Native American. You no longer count legally as Native American in the eyes of the federal government. They're also a landless tribe. They don't have a reservation. They don't have territory. Now, they explain as we go on, we'll get into the story of how exactly that happened. Now, prior to the arrival of the Spanish and mission periods, we're looking at two language groups, The Asawaswas and Mutsun languages, again, these are language families, each of which have many independent languages in them, just like French and Spanish are part of the Romantic, or the Romance language family derived from Latin, but are fundamentally different languages, and not necessarily mutually intelligible to one another. At this time period, we're looking at about 20 to 30 villages, and they were pretty autonomous, right? They were their own peoples. They would be at war with one another at different times. You have trading relationships, you have marriage partners, you have all kinds of things, but they're autonomous peoples. They're their own nations. One part of this history that I find really fascinating is the history of indigenous controlled burns and forestry practices. I really hope I can find time to get this a unit on this to the syllabus, because, indigenous peoples in North America had a really long history of their own forestry practices, and part of that included controlled burns. It also included things like, making sure your paths went where there was food, or maybe encouraging food stuff to grow along your trails. In fact, you see on the East Coast, early Europeans would write about how they walked on these pathways, and the land was there was so much bounty and so much food growing everywhere. Wow, there's just so much abundance here. And then they looked at Native American peoples and said, well, those people, they don't have governments, they didn't have things that the Europeans recognized as government. They also didn't have things that European peoples recognized as agriculture a lot of the time. But that's just because Europeans were looking for monocropping, and indigenous technology on agriculture was fucking next level, as I've said before. So Europeans couldn't even recognize this. So anyway, Europeans are writing, there's so much abundance, and native peoples they're not using it effectively. There's so much, and they're just not really using it. But from an indigenous perspective, from the perspective of indigenous forestry practices, of course you make sure that your paths go by the bushes of berries and other food stuff, because that way you have something to eat while you're walking. Of course you encourage that stuff to grow along the paths, because then you have stuff to eat while you're walking. It's just a different kind of cultural system. And so a piece of these kinds of forestry practices that many indigenous groups, again, there's over 500 federally recognized tribes. Whenever I talk about indigenous peoples broadly, I'm glossing and I'm simplifying for the sake of doing this. But, indigenous forestry practices as a whole tended to operate from very different principles. And one of that was controlled burns. Now, you may have noticed in the last years that California is commonly on fire. It's kind of a problem. There are many factors that create to this problem. And of course, one is global climate change creating longer droughts and drier conditions and things like that make this area more prone to forest fires and makes the forest fires easy to get really out of control. But there's another part. Remember what I said in a previous class about how for many indigenous scholars, they say, oh no, climate change started with colonialism? This is another one of those moments. When the United States takes over this region, they see a shit ton of old growth trees. Like, look at the redwood forests. And they're just like, wow, that's so much lumber. And their eyes get really big, and they're filled with cash signs with a cartoon, and they're just like, we're going to make so much money off of this. We're going to cut down all this wood. We're going to turn it into lumber, sell it, make a killing, and then the trees will grow back and we'll do it all again. And so the United States Park Service says, okay. We want to, on the one hand, conserve some of the landscape because, we believe that it's really important for Americans. This is the idea in the 1800s. We believe it's really important for Americans to go encounter nature so that they can, become rugged and thus proper men and, better than Europeans who are, too effeminate and too, I don't know, their culture is, in decline or whatever. That was the idea. It was very much about proper masculinity, and indoctrinating citizens into proper masculinity. But we also want to make money, so we need to make sure loggers have access to it. So we're going to try to balance conservation and profit. That was basically U.S. policy when it came to forestry for a long time. And again, they thought, all right, we cut it down and it grows back. Sick. What they found was after they cut it down, those older trees didn't grow back. Different trees grew back. Because in this time period, they had also, the United States was also removing indigenous peoples from these territories. So now all of those caretaking practices, all of those forestry practices that indigenous people had been doing for centuries, for millennia beforehand, are no longer being done. The United States had assumed that the forest, that the landscape was pristine, it was primordial, that it was a state of nature that was not impacted by human hands. But that's not true. These are ecologies that indigenous peoples had systematically and intentionally cultivated through complex systems of knowledge and technology, and part of that included controlled burns. So as I said, the trees that grew up in place of those that had been clear-cut were different species. The ecologies of the forest started changing. New species became more prominent. Really, species that thrived, if you remember from high school, like environmental science or ecology, I don't know what the fuck they call it these days, species that thrive in disturbed environments. And those old trees never grew back. But the thing is, those old trees were really resistant to forest fires, and the new trees were not. And the new trees had created all this underbrush, right? And like flammable materials would just collect over years on the surface without controlled burns, creating the conditions for massive wildfires. The natural environment that we live in today is very different than the one that indigenous peoples lived in 500 years ago. The species are different, the ecologies are different, because this was not an untouched wilderness. It was the result of indigenous forestry and agriculture. Circling back around to Amundsen, Spaniards arrive, and colonization, missionization begins around 1770. And you learned about the desecration of sacred sites, destroying villages, forced removal, conversion, slavery. At this time period, there was a slave trade in indigenous peoples. It was actually an extremely large industry, and in fact, there were entire indigenous nations who were making a killing in this new industry that had emerged of slave raiding. So they would move across hundreds and thousands of miles, raiding different peoples to collect slaves to sell to Europeans. Again, there's no common idea at this point in time that they're all Native Americans. There's no sense that they have this common agenda or identity. What there is a sense of like, oh hey, we can make a good life this way. There's money to be had. Now, many people ran away from the missions. We're going to come back to that when we read the Sim Schneider's book on missionization in California. He's a Miwok archaeologist, Native American archaeologist, does really awesome work looking at how indigenous peoples continued to use ancestral sites in the mission period as places they could escape to and seek refuge in. It's really cool, and I love that we're going to read it. I'm so excited to teach that because, like, hey, if you like this stuff, go, finish up at Cabrillo, go to UC Santa Cruz, study with Tim Snyder. So one thing we see in the mission period is massive population reduction. The population of the area is reduced from 350,000 to 200,000. That's 1 out of 3 people no longer existing over this time period. You know, if you think of yourself, if you were sitting in a physical classroom, you could look to your left and look to your right. That's one of those 3 people, you and those other 2 people. We have some specific numbers from San Juan Bautista Mission in 1833. There were 3,396 baptisms, 858 marriages, and 19,421 deaths. So deaths are radically outpacing births. Now, baptism specifically. A lot of this comes down to infant mortality rates. Infant mortality rates were astronomical in the missions. You know, it takes a lot of energy to make a whole fucking creature in your womb, give birth to it, and then have this new organism survive while they are, you know, like think of all the growing you do in the first years of your life. That's so much energy you have to consume. And think about the conditions in the mission. People being constrained, held within walls, contained, almost like a prison. Think of how quickly diseases spread in those conditions. Think of how quickly diseases spread if you aren't getting enough food. So this is a really, like, the population effect, right? We just see, like, you know, it's horrific. This is followed by the Mexican period in 1833. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the next slide. I'll stop here and go to the next slide. Next, you have the Mexican Revolution, where Mexico gains independence from the Spanish Empire. And the Mexican government turns around and passes the Mexican Secularization Act of 1833. This act nationalizes and secularizes the mission system. So where the Mexican government is seizing the land and other, like, you know, resources held by the missions, claiming them as now national rather than belonging to the friars, belonging to the missions. And it seeks to redistribute that land and repurpose these resources in a way that is in line with secular state goals. Now, part of this law involved the that much of that mission land would be returned to indigenous peoples. I want to say about 50% of that land was supposed to be returned to the converts from the missions. However, the actual result was that did not happen. Land was instead granted to Spanish and Mexican systems, soldiers who had fought in the war, other Mestizo and white folks, friends and family of the governor of Alto California. I mean, this is how governments work. And the people who were granted that land became rancheros. And this is a larger, the ranchero system is a larger system. It's essentially a plantation system. It is a agricultural, rural model of production in which you have large farms worked by labor. And that labor was primarily the indigenous peoples, right? They didn't get land, and so they become technically wage workers in their rancheros. I say technically because we're talking about very much slave-like conditions. This is very similar to what's happening in the plantations of the United States under chattel slavery. But I suppose it is not precisely chattel slavery in that sense. But it is extremely exploitative. So in this moment, you have the acceleration of human exploitation, right? Indigenous peoples are exploited for labor in the ranchos. And you also have accelerated environmental exploitation as a result of this system, including the expansion of logging. And you also have the further spread of disease. Because you have migrations of populations, so you have mestizo and white folks migrating into the area. They carry disease. They also bring other creatures, like rats, who can carry disease. Out east, this is a little bit of a tangent, but out east there are stories that the rats came before the Europeans. Because, Europeans would land, but the rats would get off the ship, but the rats would expand from there. So, there are stories about people who encountered rats first. Different species of rats from what had been in the stories from before that point. Anywho, you have migrations of peoples and animals. You also have very exploitative working conditions and the impacts that has on the immune system. And so disease was pretty bad in the mission period as well, right? Like, think about, like, from a public health perspective, you have, like, a lot of people who are not highly immunized to European diseases living in close quarters and often being worked really freaking hard. And in that situation, disease can spread very quickly. Think about sanitation. And likewise with the ranchero system, you have this further expansion of disease and a related decline, or continuing decline in indigenous population. Americans arrive in 1848, and you see the beginning of the gold rush. A lot of people were moving out to California because they realized there was gold, and that was worth a lot on these international economies. And as this happened, there were conflicts and violence with the new settlers and indigenous peoples. And one way that the U.S. tried to deal with this was by removing Native Americans and establishing reservations. Basically, putting indigenous peoples into isolated, controlled, bounded areas. Now, indigenous nations signed many treaties with the United States during this period. Right? And again, treaty making, right, that's the basis of this nation-to-nation relationship that indigenous peoples have with the United States. And on a legal basis, a treaty is the law of the land. It supersedes the Constitution. It supersedes federal law. But those treaties were never ratified by Congress, in large part due to California business interests. Now, as a result, these treaties were made confidential until 1905. They were eventually made public, but by then the United States said, oh, well, at this point the land's spoken for, settlers have taken it. It's too late now. Another part of this history is California signs executive orders that are essentially extermination orders, right? These are genocide orders. For example, they would pay bounty between 25 cents to $5 paid for each Native American person killed. They paid a lot of money through this program. And that program continued until 1859. Now we learn a little bit about Ascensión Soranzo de Cervantes, who was a really important historical figure in the Amamutsan tribal band. This is really key because, her family, her household becomes a space where tribal members gather. It becomes a community basis, right? There's this you can see that there's a sense of collective identity, and she is really playing a big role. her home becomes a repository for tribal history as well as a center for tribal activity. Now, simultaneously, like we're getting into the 1900s here, you also have several new studies and ideas about what the United States federal should be doing on a federal level. You have anthropologists like Kroeber and Alfred Kroeber and John Peabody Harrington who study Native American peoples, you know, and they sit on panels that determine like, hey, we should probably like respect treaty rights or like, you know, give compensation for people whose land was taken illegally literally in violation of our own laws. So, you know, anthropologists often set on those reports. And an example of that is the Dorrington Report in 1927. And what we see in this report, right, is there's that recognition of sovereignty, that government-to-government relationship, that thing that's saying, like, oh, no, like, we really should give back land that was taken illegally. And as a result, about 3,000 people in 45 tribes in California receive land. However, another 8,500 people, Native American people, did not, which includes 185 different tribes, including among them the Amamutsun. And in that moment, the United States dropped their trust responsibility and land recognition. It said, okay, y'all, because our report said you don't actually need land, we're going to stop recognizing you as an indigenous nation on that nation-to-nation level. So this report has a really big impact on the Amamutsun tribe. And the thing is, they didn't even know that research was being done. This is such a common process. It's almost identical to the histories that I taught about Massachusetts history. It happened earlier. The parallel report was earlier in Massachusetts. That would have been in the 1600s. But it was pretty much the exact same thing. And it has many of the same effects today, which is that today Amamutsun people are still working to be recognized as a Native American tribe, to restore that nation-to-nation relationship and those treaty obligations that have not been respected, that have not been honored. And this is the kind of key tension when we talk about, the Dorrington Report or Alfred Kroeber and other anthropologists, right? Is like, these are human beings who are suddenly in charge of deciding who is and is not Native American and who is and is not deserving of land. And in many ways, so much of that breaks down to happenstance. Who did Kroeber study? And what versus who did a different anthropologist study? Because the people Kroeber studied, many of them become federally recognized. But anyway, there's more politics there. We'll get it. There's a lot of interpersonal relationships and drama between these researchers that has resulted in many Native folks in California not being recognized by the United States federal government. This is a really common situation in this part of the world. In 1992, the Amamutsun apply for recognition as a Native American tribe from the federal government. That is a long fucking bureaucratic road. It takes decades. And with that, let's come back to the maps. I had you look at two different maps from the Amamutsun Tribal Band's website of this place right here, right? And so how can we think about Lisa Brooks' perspective and what she was doing with maps in New England and applying that here? Because these are two contemporary maps. They were made by people recently. And each of these maps demonstrates different kinds of assumptions, right? Like you might ask, why are there these dotted lines around the map to the right? Why you have these kinds of areas, but but then there's kind of a little buffer, empty space between, and like it's dotted instead of a solid line. What might that be about? What are the implications there, and how does that relate to the maps we were looking at from Lisa Brooks? Likewise, if you compare these two, they prioritize different information. The map on the left, you have the big gray letters, which are language groups, or a language family, meaning there are several different peoples or nations who spoke different languages within that larger language family. The same way that French and Spanish are part of the larger Romance language family, but are different languages. We see the same thing with native language and communities. And so, yeah, just compare these two maps and see what you notice differently between them. What is marked in one map versus in the other? What is left out? And you can compare this to the nativelands.ca website that you looked at in the beginning of this semester. That website was made from a global perspective. So it's not like the people who are making it can tell exactly where these lines are or can go deep into the archival record of each of these little places over the planet of the Earth. Likewise, in that map, many territories will that'll have multiple people's names attached to it, multiple different Native American nations. There's many reasons that could happen. Part of that could be that both nations used that land, that they shared it. It could be that there's a historical shift that happened, where one nation was here at one point in time and another nation was there later. It could also just be that the data is a little gray, right? And then when we come back and look at this map, these two maps of California and the Monterey Bay, likewise, where do you think these authors are getting this information that they're using? Or, I'm sorry, where do you think these map makers are getting that information? Chances are they're drawing on historical documentation. Most of that's going to be left by Spanish missionaries. And so there's going to be certain perspectives and assumptions and beliefs that were just held to be natural by Spanish religious figures in the 1700s, but may not be the kinds of things we would agree with. And so how are those biases built into the data itself of the historical record, the very data we can use to start mapping indigenous territory prior to the Spanish colonial moment? And really, as you leave this unit, think about these maps and think through what happens when we start treating this place here as native space. How can we start approaching this landscape right here where you live in? How can we approach that differently?